My name is Danny Weiss. I live in Orlando, Florida, in the US. I've been working in missions information for about the last decade. Um, Started in mobilization, so sending out missionaries and organizing trips, helping with logistics and overseeing where we were sending people, and then got into training as well. So started teaching missions and missiology to a lot of participants. Since then, I've worked on a few larger data projects. I think one of the most special to me is called Stratus. Stratus.Earth, what we did was we took missions information and married it to all sorts of different secular geopolitical information to try to give insight into not just who are the unreached people groups in the world, but why are they unreached? What barriers exist that prevents them from becoming reached? Where are things helpful, towards creating access to the gospel, and where are there impediments and hindrances? So that was a really fun project. There was a lot of aspects of data synthesis and visualization, which I really enjoyed. Um, since then, I've been working more in the translation side of things. So with a translation ministry, I was over their data systems and kind of helped inform our strategy based on where we would put our resources. So what we focused on was finding large groups of mobilized Christian communities that had access to minor communities in their areas and regions, and equipping them with Bible translation materials that they could then teach and use independently of us. So trying to remove sort of the traditional model of a Western missionary or somebody going and learning a new language to translate, trying to change that and equipping local churches to do that work for themselves. So I'm very excited to share with you guys. I'll be sharing about least reached peoples today, and giving you guys hopefully some helpful context. I'm going to share my screen if that is all right. Yes, okay, great. All right. The people group approach, I don't know how familiar you guys are with people groups. But I want to get into a little bit of the history and terminology because it is very specifically defined. And it has been the driving cornerstone of mission strategy for at least the last 50 years, if not even before that. In the 1930s, there were two men that were really prominent in helping shape this movement. The first was a man named William Cameron Townsend, who was working in Guatemala. He realized that a lot of the smaller indigenous tribes didn't understand Spanish to the degree that would allow them to read the Bible for themselves. He was the one who eventually went on to create the organization Wycliffe, focused on Bible translation into every language. This was this big revelation at the time where the church in Guatemala thought that the Spanish Bible would be sufficient, and he was pushing back and saying, no, there needs to be other Bibles for people to read. There's a famous quote. One of the people he was working, a monk, said, if your God is so powerful, how come he can't speak my language? Something like that. And so that really started the translation movement. Another man, Donald McGavran, was working in India, and he realized that the gospel wasn't passing between people of different castes, even if they spoke the same language, even if they were in the same area. So he realized that there were these social, economic, ethnic barriers that existed beyond just language, beyond just nationality, that also prevented the gospel from spreading. Both of these ideas were kind of summed up at the first Lausanne Conference in the 1970s, mostly by a man named Ralph Winter. His big vision was that there would be a church for every people, and his focus was that we should focus on forgotten peoples, people that won't necessarily get the gospel or have access to church unless we specifically focus on them. He went on to found Frontier Ventures, a major missions organization in the US. He was the one who started the missions training class Perspectives, and now he is also the one that spawned Joshua Project, one of the major databases of people groups still today. So the reason that it's so important to understand this is that people group actually has a very specific definition, and many people will often use it incorrectly. People will use unreached incorrectly all the time. But when you're looking at data sets, there is a very specific way that it is used, and that has a lot of implications on the way that data systems are made, and then thusly on how strategy is enacted, which I think is really important to unpack. So we'll just take some time to go through this kind of, not briefly, but unpack it. A people group is the largest group within which the gospel can spread as a church planting movement. So there are several things right away. One, these are bounded groups of maximum size. It's basically what is the largest group that I can count as one group that the gospel will spread in on its own accord without hitting other barriers. It's important to note that they are mutually exclusive. So in traditional people group data sets, you are either in one people group or in another. There is no overlap. There is no opportunity for kind of a gray area or anything like that. So you have this very distinct set model, and that the boundaries are defined specifically by evangelistic purposes. And we'll get into exactly what those boundaries are. The first boundary is one of understanding, and this is the aspect of language. All right, so it's defined by what language do you speak. If you don't speak the same language as somebody else, the gospel has a really hard time crossing from that one group to another. I mean, it's kind of quite obvious, but that's the first boundary. The second boundary is one of acceptance or understanding. So this is defined by a barrier of relatability. Essentially, like what ethnicity are you? Or what's your caste or your tribe? Anything like this? Is there a shared history or culture? This also prevents the gospel spreading from one group to another. So this definition is actually it's quite specific. It kind of puts the world into this lens of ethno-linguistic divisions, fragmentation. So either your group shares the same language and ethnicity, or you are considered a different people group. And this has implications for church planning strategy. It has implications for mission sending strategy. It has implications for how funds are given out and who's doing what and where. And so you'll notice already that you can probably think of examples where maybe somebody or even yourself might not fit specifically into a single people group. This is part of the issue as the world is developing and something that we'll hopefully tackle even in this next hour and going forward. When we talk about people groups, we really filter them through the singular lens. Are they reached or are they unreached? And this gets a little bit confusing as well, or at least unintuitive. So reachedness refers to a people group's collective access to the gospel, not an individual's adherence to the gospel. So often you will hear people say, oh, my neighbor is unreached. That's not a correct use of the term. What we're talking about is a people group's ability to have access to the gospel. Are there churches in their context? Are there pastors who speak their languages? Are there Bibles in the stores that they can go and buy? Is there freedom of religion? That kind of contributes to the essence of when a group is reached. The question is really, is there a formed, viable, and self-sustaining church within this people group that is able to reach the rest of this people group with the gospel without any additional missionary assistance? The idea being that if there is a large enough church, a well-equipped enough church, then they can reach the rest of the people group without help. If there's not a large enough church, you would need outside missionaries to come in and help start planting church planting movements in order for that church to grow. This does get technical, so there is a specific numerical boundary for when a people group is considered unreached and when it is considered reached. If the number of evangelical believers in a people group is higher than 2%, then that group is considered reached. It doesn't mean that everybody's a Christian. It doesn't mean that everybody has heard the gospel. All it means is that there's probably there's an adequate church presence that over time, that group might become saturated with the gospel in a way that they would understand. If there is less than 2% professing evangelical Christians and less than 5% nominal Christians, a group is considered unreached. Again, this group might have 1.9% Christians. It might be right on that threshold, but they are under that barrier where they are now considered unreached. There's not enough of a kind of center of mass, or enough impetus, enough gravity, enough of a church base to continue reaching the rest of that group. There are some additional terms over the years that have popped up. Frontier people groups is something that started becoming a thing probably around a decade ago in the mid 2010s. This is a group where they've lowered the threshold again. So now any group with less than 0.1% Christian is considered a frontier people group. So these are your very unreached groups, essentially. These are the groups where there really is, you're not talking 1%, you're talking a very minimal Christian presence. Often so small that there is, they might, I don't want to say that they might not as well be there, but that's the idea, right? That you have this very, very minimal Christian presence. The final term we'll touch is this unreached, unengaged. And what this simply means is that there are no Christians, there's no church, and there's nobody doing anything actively to start a church. As you can imagine, this is kind of hard to measure. Often gets into the gray area of if we don't, if we know something's going on, is there, you usually know that because there's a church. So we don't know what we don't know. And often engagement is hard to track. There's all sorts of instances where somebody said, I'll reach them. And then 5 years later, nothing's happening, or we lose track of who's doing what, or what have you. So unengaged, unreached is becoming a very like in fashion term. But you have to realize that it's quite undefined and it's quite hard to track. All sorts of organizations have their own different definitions and standards of what constitutes engaged or not. Is it somebody praying for that people group? Is it a church that said, I will send people to them in 5 years? Is it a neighboring disciple making movement that's going on in their vicinity? There's all sorts of questions around that. So there are two primary sources where you can find people group information. There are other lists, but these are the two most comprehensive and most widely used. The first is Joshua Project, joshuaproject.net. They're my preferred choice for people group information. They are very robust. They're very comprehensive. They've been going for about 25 years now, since the early 90s. They have a robust network of thousands of volunteers that contribute information. They're widely trusted. I know the guys personally. They're a small team that works on this, and they're very passionate about keeping their data as transparent and up to date as possible. They're very easy to work with. They'll share their information. Their information forms the basis, the backbone of a lot of additional sort of people group lists, one being Operation World. Typically, it's been in a book form, but they do have an online presence. The World Christian Encyclopedia, WCE, is a major source. They last released, I believe, right before COVID in 2019, at the end of 2019. So their data is a few years outdated now, but they use the people group system as well. That's Joshua Project derived. And Stratus.earth, the project I worked on for data visualization, we use Joshua Project as our core people group database as well. The other one is owned by the IMB, that's peoplegroups.org. They have a different list. And so like you'll see this even in these two comprehensive lists, there's a lot of discrepancy. There's a lot of variation. The numbers are very different. Joshua Project will say there's around 17,000 people groups. Peoplegroups.org lists around 12,000 people groups. The number of unreached is more similar, more along the 7,000 mark, but they just have different approaches. The one thing that makes peoplegroups.org unique is that they track engagement status. So who's working in this people group? Is there anything ongoing? Traditionally, that's only been through the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC. So they only report engagement among IMB missionaries. So it's not comprehensive in that regard. They are changing though. They're trying to move forward and be more inclusive. And so these data sets are getting more aligned, but traditionally you've had quite a separation of lists, which I think is quite interesting. It's good to know at least. On Joshua Project, if you've been to their site, this will be familiar. If not, every country has a roll-up, like a national total of the number of people groups, the number of groups that are unreached, and the percentages, populations, and whatnot. So there's all sorts of information here available with API. They have lists going down through every people group. Every people group has a profile, so you can learn more about that people group. You see the population in this country, the population in the globe. You see the language they speak, if they're indigenous or not, how reached they are. All this information is available. But I want, and it's all visible on a map as well. There are two ways of mapping people group information. Joshua Project uses point data. So they estimate a center point, GPS coordinate for each people group. So what you'll see on this map is that each people group, regardless of size, has one dot attributed to it. So for the US, like the largest group is US whitish Americans, and that people group is in the United States with a single dot. It would be dark green. It would be considered reached. And you'd be able to, you'd be able to like hover over and, see which people group is which, but it doesn't tell you a lot of information about the size of the people group or the geographical sphere or whatever. A lot of that information is also made up. It's hard to estimate the center of a people group, so they just put it somewhere. That's often a thing. Um, peoplegroups.org uses what's the word, polygon data. So they'll draw out polygons showing kind of the sphere for where this people group is. There's issues with that too, because they don't often consider overlap. So they'll have a hard boundary in between people groups when there, in fact, there might be sort of mixing. They have, a lot of their information is self-curated, so it can be difficult to ascertain the validity of different polygons. So what we're going to get into next is some of the issues with the people group paradigm, some of the gaps and where it falls short. And you'll see this right on Joshua Project's site. They're aware of all these issues. Mostly everybody in the missions information space is aware of these issues. The problem is that nobody has good solutions for any of them. And at this point, the people group system is so entrenched and such an integral part of Christian mission strategy that it's very hard to make significant changes. So some of the issues that come up, you'll see like the sources are varied and many have different degrees of accuracy. They have people contributing information to them. So they'll have pastors or missions leaders telling them, this is how big this group is. And that information might be true, might not be true. And so they have to make editorial decisions based on how much they trust a source, or based on whether that data conflicts with things they already know, or based on if it can fit into the national population of a country. Their data has varying ages, so they don't just do a census of the world once. They have a rolling input of information. So you might have a piece of information in front of you that is 30 days old and one that is 30 years old. And there's really no way of knowing which is which. A zero can mean anything. It can mean actually zero. It can mean a very small rounded number. It can mean we don't know, or we left it blank, or we filled in something. The list of languages that most missions organizations use for Bible translation, it's 1/7. It's about 15% of that information is just made up. They don't have it, so they guessed. And there's really no way of knowing what's true or what's not true, or how old a piece of information is. Data is not as precise as it appears. They discourage you from using raw numbers based on their percent attribution. Some are informed estimates, some are more accurate. In every case, they're bound by what is called the 100% rule. So population data needs to equal 100% in a country. So they can't have guesses or gaps. They have to always be adjusting for population increases, kind of, what's the word, fairly across the country. So they're very limited. Basically, they have a table that they need to fill. Every entry needs to be full, and it all needs to equal 100%. And that is difficult to maintain over time. And the last one is really, I think, the most important. On the ground reality may vary from what is presented here, and this happens all the time, where if you look at what a global database says, and then you talk to people that global data represents, they'll say that doesn't sound like us at all, or that's crazy different, or that's just wrong, or that's not the name we use, or wait, it's saying there's no Christians, there's a ton, or it's saying we're reached, but we really don't have that, or it says we have a Bible, but I've never heard of that, or all the time. There's issues with global data. And so the transition. Yes, the strategic issue confronting the people group paradigm is this. How do we adapt a people group centric missional strategy to keep pace with a rapidly changing global context? If the world is changing very quickly now, what used to make a lot more sense 50 years ago in sectioning off the world into different ethnicities and languages doesn't make as much sense in 2024, when people can speak several languages, when people are born into biracial families, when people are moving, or you have immigration, or large urban centers that didn't exist 20 years ago. All this is affecting the world very rapidly. And the people group paradigm, I think, really struggles to keep pace with reflecting the way that those changes are occurring. You even see it in the information. If you take a number from 2010 and freeze it in time and now look at the numbers today, everything is worse. Intuitively, you would think if the church was strategically working through people group paradigm, and strategically planting churches in unreached people groups, you would think that there would be less unreached people groups today, that we would have reached them. And what you see is the opposite. The more we know about the world, the more fragmented it becomes. So people groups that used to be one people group, maybe now we've realized they actually need to be separate people groups. So the number of people groups is increasing. People are having babies. They're multiplying faster than we are reaching them with the gospel. There's all these issues that kind of point to the fact that this paradigm is limited in its strategic value moving forward, and you can kind of see it plateauing in the numbers as well. So major gaps that I see, and this is where I'm really passionate. This is my niches are really geopolitics and demographic information. So I love this stuff. It's what gets me going, and it's what causes me a lot of concern when you have these frozen lists that don't reflect on the ground reality and aren't helping move things forward strategically. But nobody's really figured out how to deal with these things. So immigration and migration is one of the biggest ones. You have literally countries that are 50% different demographically than they were 20 years ago. You have that often not represented in the data at all. If you look on Joshua Project, they still don't have the 2 or 3 million Syrian people that have gone from Syria to Lebanon represented in their information. There's still these huge gaps that aren't reflected in terms of how people are moving. And when you look at the information deeply, you see that they try to get into diaspora community information, but the data is so poor. I've heard them say this, like they almost, I think they've given up trying to represent the diaspora community in the US because it's so complicated and they're so far behind the ball. So it's really difficult to represent where people are right now. It's really difficult to represent things like globalization and urbanization. People are moving to the cities, speaking major trade languages, getting jobs. They have connections to their hometowns. They have connections to their home countries even. Often a city is more of like a cohesive unit than a people group within that city, or people in that city would identify as part of that city more than they would identify as their people group. So this is really hard to represent in the information. And you have cities that are becoming so populous so quickly that it is really hard to keep pace with that. The people group paradigm really struggles to deal with place well. I mean, even with that GPS coordinate of the center point of the people group, if you have a large people group, that point is useless. It doesn't tell me anything about where these people are, what cities, how many of them are in this city or that city or town, whatever. There's no overlay on the actual map, like an actual Google map. So if you were to like drill in and look at even a small people group, it wouldn't necessarily tell you what village they were in or what city they're near or anything like that. That's starting to change as people get more into GIS, but I think there's a huge lag there. And even then, there's value and opportunity for people to be able to contribute location information on the ground. You could potentially crowdsource this. You could have people have access to changing polygon lines or placing dots as to where they know people are and what villages and whatnot. But curating that information becomes then the major issue there. There is a lot of attempt to track engagement, who's doing what, where are their churches, where are their pastors, where have they planted church plants from those. But a lot of that information is very sensitive and it's owned by specific organizations who don't like to share their information. So getting anything on a global scale is really difficult in that regard. And it's really hard to incentivize people to share that information. If you're familiar at all with disciple-making movements, these rapidly forming groups of disciples in house churches and whatnot, they are notorious for not sharing any of their information ever due to secrecy and sensitivity. So there's this huge gap in what they'll say. They'll say, hey, we have these millions of churches and these millions of disciples in these very difficult areas, and that information is not represented globally on the people group lists. So it becomes very difficult to track what is actually going on, who's doing what, where is their movement. It becomes very confusing. There's an increasing issue of like a gap of self-identification and representation, where there's plenty of examples where somebody would find out that this is the name of their people group and it would actually be like an offensive term or completely incorrect. And they would like have issues say, how can you call us, how can you call yourselves a Christian missions organization and call us that? Like, I can't believe I have to tell you not to call us that offensive term. So there's issues of how we represent people on these global lists. Frankly, it's trying to take a template that is just too dull and put it over the entire world and say everything should fit within these boxes, and it just doesn't work like that. You have different ways that people identify, whether it's by generation, whether it's by first, second language, whether it's by what village. There's different ways that countries are structured. Mountain communities have different levels of like how they identify than jungle communities, where you're more along a river. Um, there's all sorts of different ways. In East Asia, generation is more of a thing. In Africa, tribe is often a big thing. So there's all these different ways that the people group model just doesn't represent. And the issue with that is that when you rely on those people to give input to information and they're disenfranchised by how they're represented, they're not going to contribute what knowledge they have. And that just continues to exacerbate the gap, right? It continues to create this big drift, this whatever schism between global data and actual on the ground reality. Fuzzy data is one of my biggest, I don't want to say pet peeves or issues, but the reality is nobody knows these things to a specific degree. Nobody knows exactly how many people are this or that or whatnot. And what you end up having to do wisely is to rely on multiple sources of information, often which contradict each other. And the data sets have no way to represent that. They have no way to represent, hey, this person's saying there are 10 million and this person's saying there are 11 million. And this person's saying it's 1% Christian and this person's saying it's 5% Christian. What do we do with that information? There's no way to show that right now. Subgroups are a big thing. So, I mean, it kind of, you'll probably have felt this to some degree already in this talk, but calling 300 million people a single people group is it doesn't do any justice to the individual nuances within that group of people. There's no way that 300 million people kind of share the same identity or have the same, sense of identification. So there's all these issues with subgroups. There's issues with getting them recognized. There's often people will submit, hey, we're actually a different group, and that will not go recognized by a global data set. They won't integrate it into the global system. You see this a lot with unengaged people groups now. You have organizations trying to focus on where are the groups that are completely unengaged with the gospel. Well, a lot of those are subgroups, smaller groups where like it's like a sub tribe or a subsect or a slight, what's the word, a dialect maybe of a specific language where globally a single language is recognized, but on the ground maybe there's 10 or 15 dialects of that language and they're not all the same. So how do we deal with that? How do we tackle that when the people group paradigm is limiting? And to be completely transparent, the reason nobody likes to recognize those is because it makes the task larger. And honestly, funders don't really want to do that. They like having a closed list. This is the list of languages. This is the list of people groups. We can finish this in a sense. They're not really interested in getting into increased nuance, despite the way the world is going. And then finally, my last one on this list is synthesized demographic and geopolitical information. So often what you'll see is ministries just focus on evangelism. Is this group reached? Are they unreached? Is there a church? Are there Christians? Are there not? And they really don't give any uh, consideration to other factors that are at play. What's the level of education? What's the level of poverty? What's the spiritual climate? What is their tradition or experience with Christianity? What is their access to infrastructure or access to technology? All of these have a great bearing on how a church can be strategic or a ministry can be strategic in what it's trying to accomplish. But often that information is not integrated into people group lists. So these are the gaps I see as the world is moving forward. I'm super excited to hear kind of what you guys take away from this, or what opportunities you see, or what issues you resonate with just from this brief talk.
So I will have two questions before we go to breakout rooms, which are related to thinking about who we're designing for. So the two questions, well, so first, like, who are we designing for? What's an example? I know there's like multiple sides to a project. You know, there's the people who are unreached, there's the people who are reaching, there's, you know, who are all the stakeholders?
One would be the individuals that the data represents. So who are the people on the ground who are going to look at this and say, oh, this is the people group that it says I'm in? That's one. Second would be the people working in close proximity with those groups. So your people in ministry or your churches that are in the field, missionaries in the field working with this information, trying to use this information from a strategic perspective of what can it tell me about how I can work in ministry within this context. Then the third would be like your West, I don't want to say Western, but your removed mobilizers. So those who are in strategic positions where they're making decisions. Where do we give money? Where do we send missionaries? Where do I deploy my teams? They use and depend on this information to make those decisions. So they have a stake. And then your fourth group is the ones who are giving money. And so the funders who are saying, this is where we're going to send our $250 million. This is where we're going to invest our 10 million. This is where, and often where this gets complicated is ministry decisions are affected by really trivial things. Like a group might decide to give their money to a group that is unreached rather than reached. And so now those people in that community might actually be incentivized to lower their numbers and underreport Christian status because they know that they're not going to receive funding and teams if they become reached. And so there's all sorts of politics that go along with that to complicate things. But those are the four groups that come to mind as to who would be using this information.
What happens before, during, and after a project, if you can categorize that, and if you can define like briefly what a project might be?
All these data sets exist because somebody communicated something. So there's some input of information. Increasingly, like the opportunities for inputs of information are becoming more varied. Anything from GPS coordinates on phones to census information to public surveys to what have you. So first, you'd get information that would inform sort of the data set. Typically, like an organization, like a ministry, would get this data set and then make decisions about where they would send teams or incorporate the information into their sending strategy or their ministry strategy. Church leaders in a global context will often be not only reporting information, but also using information to plan what villages they're going to go to next or kind of inform, do we need to focus on this or that, or where are people groups near us that we can reach? Or increasingly countries, I think, are with growing Christian bases are saying, okay, now that we have a church, where should we send missionaries to? What do we do? That sort of a thing. I'm not sure if that's answering your question though.
Yeah, so I guess that's one thing that happens before, and I guess that there's like resources involved and everything, like training and all that stuff. What happens during? What are some of the ways that, and then I guess if something can be, what happens when it's like, that point between like unreached and reached? What happens after?
Okay, so when there's a shift in, I don't want to say power dynamic, but when you have, say, a very, very small or non-existent church, the focus is on, entry strategy. How are missionaries entering, or how are people in proximate communities entering that community? Who are they talking to? Who are they finding? Often people will look for a person of peace, somebody who can help them understand or get the lay of the land, or provide, a safe place or a hospitable place for them to work from or have entry into the community. Um, as disciples are made, as the gospel spreads, usually over years, over even decades, as more and more teams are, focusing on an area, as churches are being planted, there becomes a point where the church is now existing and the focus is then equipping the church. How are we discipling these people? How are we raising up new leaders? How are we training pastors? How are we allowing them to continue reaching their people? Eventually there becomes a point where like that sort of ministry role or missionary role is not obsolete, but changes in dynamic, and where less the effort is on focus, like you would call it like a frontier context, like the front end of missions. Less on we have to become the first, pioneering team to start something, and more on how are we equipping and supporting the local church. Often that dynamic is really difficult to get right. And ministries will often struggle with, overstaying or trying to be there forever, or, perpetuating problems or whatever, just so that they can be more involved. But eventually, a church does mature. There are usually at that point, seminaries, places where pastors can get trained, or they are sent. People are sent out to seminaries in other countries or other places, and maybe return. And then at that point, eventually, a church is independent enough where it has its own organizing structure. It has its own understanding of the context in its country. Eventually, it would develop into having more of a missional focus, where now they're the ones using information to send teams. So you'll see this with a country like Brazil, who, 150 years ago, it was mostly pioneer church planting. Now they have an enormous, like, well-established church, a starting to be functional missionary sending arm. They're also engaging in missions, on a more, I don't want to say industrial, but an organized level. And so you kind of see that transition over time. So the transition between, no church to established church is really one of that equipping, gradual maturity, own the ability to own their own discipleship and their own outreach and their own ministry. And often those things are hampered by like bottlenecks of theological training or seminary education. So that's, I know, a big issue where if there were more seminaries or more opportunities, like you would be able to create leaders faster. Translation often becomes a bottleneck. The translation process is slow, and as it's been mostly owned by the West, there's been a lot of issues with scale and scope. It does not and cannot keep up with the need for Bible translation, so that's a huge issue. I think integrating the underground church or the disciple-making movements with an overground church is something that is not quite connected yet. So there, it's one thing to have rapidly made disciple-making movements. It's another to incorporate that information into ministry strategy if you're not aware of what's going on, or if there's a disconnect there. So yeah, hopefully that answers some of your question. I mean, but yeah, you're talking about the gradual growth and maturity of the church.
In our group, we were talking about firstly the struggle of being able to accurately represent this data, and also in terms of really trying to empathize and see how we can better represent the unreached. That was where the conversation was starting to go, and then we ran out of time.
And then on our side, Peniel, do you want to finish sharing what you were just sharing about what you're doing with that data that you've collected?
That after collecting the data, what we do that we find out the people group and caste and everything, we divide it. Then we try to reach it, like within 1 year or something like that. We decide that we have to reach to these people, that group of people that they haven't heard about the gospel, and then we go to them, and in that way only we try to achieve our the vision, that what every year that one we do, like we target the place like where the gospel has been not reached, and we go to there and we find out how many group of peoples are living there, what are the caste, and literate, like literacy, all these things we just collect. And in that way we find out that is there any Christians or any other religion people, so any the gospel has been reached or not. Then finally we start our journey that with sending some pastors or missionaries to that place, and start with children ministry. Children ministry, like we invite the children that through that, actually here what happened, so many, as the brother was saying that, no, what happened in our city, this city is like from all over, like, India, like, from different part of India, like, all are working here. So this, because of, it is close to, very close to the capital city of New Delhi, we, like, the India. So from south and west and east and west, no, from all four part of the people are living here, and they are laborers, especially like, laborers. So it is very difficult to, because sometimes they are migrated, like, they will be working here for just for 1 month, then they will go to their native place, or else they will travel to another place to search the job. So it is quite difficult that, no, in that situation what we do, like, we just establish a, like, care cell or something, like, 10 group of people, and through that, we just, in that way we reach. That's what I'm trying to say.